In 1989, I spent the last week of the summer living among and interviewing the fishermen and the citizens of Cordova, Alaska. They were the human victims of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and I was drawn up to Valdez actually by the suffering birds and the otters. I went up there to research a movie about the animal rescue. But it turned out the fishermen were the story. Once they had realized that federal, state, and corporate entities were moving too slowly to save their fisheries, they took matters into their own hands, and they imported booms from Europe. I think they were even sometimes fighting with the government entities to get the ones they needed, and they placed them around the most vulnerable areas of their fisheries. And fishing still was destroyed for that year, so Exxon hired many of these fishermen to take part in the massive cleanup. And the luckiest among them became what was known, a new word, spillionaires that summer. They made a ton of money working for Exxon, and I believe also signing sort of non-disclosures that they would not be able to talk about the spill or the cleanup. In any case, the natural, the social, the economic fabric of Cordova and Prince William Sound has never been the same. Last month, 19 years after the spill, and 2 days after climate change scientist James Hansen told Congress that ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel CEOs, quote, should be tried for high crimes against humanity and nature for their role in delaying the global response to climate change, 2 days after that, the Supreme Court reduced a $2.5 billion punitive judgment against Exxon for the Valdez disaster to $500 million. Now, this is 19 years after the actual accident, and Exxon, remember, made more than $40 billion in profits last year. Today's guest, RIKI, at the time, was a commercial salmon fisherman with a Ph.D. in marine biology back in '89. So she experienced firsthand the devastating effects of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. She retired from fishing. She founded 3 nonprofit organizations to deal with the lingering harm. And she's the author of the award-winning Sound Truth and Corporate Myths, The Legacy of the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill. Another book, Alaska's Copper River Delta, which is, I believe, her favorite place on Earth. And the upcoming Not One Drop, Betrayal and Courage in the Wake of the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill. I last interviewed RIKI in 1989 when she was one of the spokespeople for the Cordova Fishermen's Union. And Dr. Ott and I will look at the long, sad aftermath of the spill, but with an eye toward the broader context of corporate power versus nature and corporate power versus humanity. And she believes this is the civil rights movement of our day. Welcome, RIKI Ott.
Good morning. Good afternoon there, I guess, Terrence.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, 11 a.m. there, noon here. I like listeners to get to know a bit about the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. So I mentioned in the intro your path since the spill, but how did you end up fishing in Alaska in the first place?
That's a long and convoluted story, but the short of it is that I grew up in Wisconsin back in the late 1960s, and I was 13 years old walking home to school, back and forth to school from home, and literally birds were falling out of the trees, dying. And, you know, when you're 13, who do you go to? You go to your parents and you say, what's wrong? And my dad put a dying robin in my hands, and I watched this bird's eyes dilating and shrinking, and the bird was shaking. And my dad explained about the neurotoxin DDT. And he gave me Rachel Carson's Silent Spring to read. I read that book. I thought, this is amazing that one person can take all this science and all these legal papers and put them into a book that an ordinary person like my father, he wasn't a scientist, he was a paper salesman, that he can understand what's going on and then move to change the world. Because my father rallied a bunch of his friends, raised funds, and sued ultimately the state of Wisconsin over DDT. Wisconsin became the first state to ban DDT, and that was in 1972, and I left kind of with a life lesson that, wow, when something's wrong, you get a bunch of friends together and you fix the problem. And I also left with all of Rachel Carson's readings under my belt when I went away for college because I wanted to become a marine biologist. So I bounced from the East Coast to over to various places in Europe, finally to the West Coast, University of Washington, with a doctorate in oil pollution and a master's. And I thought, 13 years, I got to take one summer off. So I asked a girlfriend to take care of my dog for me for my one summer off in 1985 and never went back. I just landed in Cordova and totally fell in love with it.
Yeah, as I said, I spent that 1 week there at the end of the summer, the final week of the summer of '89, and fell in love with the place and you and your allies there. And I remember one of the most stirring things for me was we sailed the fishing boats on that final day of summer up from Cordova to the end of the pipeline in Valdez, Alaska. And that was a joyful, serious, wonderful event for me. What?
Sounds an amazing place. So.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, never mind what you could see at every moment when you were out there, as well as the people. Now, because I don't think I'll get back to it, but I don't jump on it right now, one thing that I saw in reading some of your interviews is you say you try to live each day half for others and half for you. What do you mean, and how do you do it? And once you do that, then we'll dig into the issues.
Well, we're in my half a day for others right now, and I'm a morning person, so I get up at about 5 o'clock, give or take, and I work through till about 1 o'clock, and that's my 8 hours. Whenever I can fit in there works, and then I go see what the flavor of the day is and go hiking or ice skating or snowshoeing or canoeing, and it fits into Alaska's lifestyle because in the winter here it's dark, except for about 6 hours during the middle of the day, so I can catch that window. And in the summer, daylight goes on until midnight, 1 o'clock. So it's pretty good.
Yeah, for those of us who have never lived in that notion that you can knock off at 1 and have 10 or 11, 12 hours of daylight is pretty charming. So I want to cover a lot of ground in the about 18 minutes we have left. First, so I'm giving you that heads up. First, the specifics of the aftermath of the spill. Then the recent Supreme Court ruling, after nearly 19 years of litigation, to cut 80% of the punitive damages. And then finally, a look at what this tells us about the larger society in terms of roles, rights, responsibilities of corporations, and so on. So first, what have been the long-term effects of that spill in 1989 on the natural, social, and economic health of the Sound and Cordova?
In 2 minutes, right? Okay, here we go.
I know. 5 minutes.
All right. You have to understand that going into this spill, the scientists thought that oil caused only short-term harm to animals. People effects weren't even counted, okay? So, and that was the basis of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. So the scientists came in and told all the fishermen, hey, there won't be any long-term problems. Fishermen, you can keep fishing here. Well, the fishermen said, okay, but we're going to wait and see before we breathe in all clear. We're going to see if the baby herring and the baby salmon that were oiled as eggs in 1989 or as baby fish, embryos, juvenile, they're at various life stages. We're going to wait to see if they come back as adults, and then we're going to wait to see if those adults can actually reproduce and have viable offspring, babies that return. So that's a number of years post-spill. For pink salmon, the first real test was, 1990. Okay, the fish came back. There were less of them than we had hoped and were predicted, but they came back. So we had to wait 2 more years to see if those fish could produce viable offspring. That was 1992. Boom. Fish run collapsed. Pink salmon collapsed in Prince William Sound. Fishermen said, doesn't look good. We will wait for the second test, which is the odd year stock, completely different genetic stock, that were eggs in 1989. Well, those eggs came back as adult fish in 1991. We all said, whew, now, again, not as many as we thought, but they were there. Well, we had to wait 2 more years, 1993, to see if they could produce viable offspring. They could not. There was another run collapse in 1993 of pink salmon. But hold that thought, because before August, when the pink salmon failed to return for the second time, the herring also collapsed in 1993 in April. And that's significant because the herring have a little bit different life cycle than pink salmon. Herring eggs in 1989 were basically babies and young fish for 4 years, and they matured, or they should have matured, in 1993 and become adults. Well, all of a sudden, 1993 rolls around, and it's a wipeout of the herring. And we thought somehow those baby fish had been affected back in 89, where they couldn't become adults. So the fishermen, our patients, snapped, and we blockaded Valdez Narrows, which was a huge act of civil disobedience, held up tanker traffic for 3 days in order to extract a promise from Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt that he would conduct or see that the trustee council in charge of the restorative science for the Exxon Valdez oil spill would conduct something called ecosystem studies, which had never been done before, okay? But the fishermen felt that the scientists were leading us astray by just looking at birds or fish or a single species like a sea otter. The scientists weren't giving us the whole picture. They weren't connecting the dots to tell us what was wrong with Prince William Sound, what were the ecosystem effects. So those studies started, and they took 6 years to complete, where you look at multiple generations over time and the effects of the generation, the generational effects to oil. And there was a lot of questions. There's hundreds of papers. So those answers didn't start surfacing until 1999 and 2000. Okay, now back up, because we went to court in 1994 to prove harm from the Exxon Valdez. We didn't have the long-term damage study.
Right. What you had at that point was the failures of the runs in 92 and 93, and so you file the suit. And let me just tell people, this is the voice is RIKI. She's a former fisherman, a marine biologist, and an author, and we're talking about the effects of the 1989 Exxon Valdez spill.
Okay, and if you read, there was a couple reporters who interviewed jurors from the 1994 trial. And if you read what they did, they got confused with 92 and 93 run collapses. There was no science to support it. They threw them out. So basically they gave us fish closures in 89 and some fish tainting in 89 and some closed fisheries in subsequent years, but really not what our true damages have been. Okay, so it materializes as a result of these ecosystem the ecosystem studies, that oil actually does have long-term effects. It's a completely different fraction of oil than the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act that are based on. It's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and they interact with a body differently. They cause all sorts of reproductive problems.
Okay, now let me cut in for a second for clarification. So you said a different fraction of the oil. What you're saying is that wherever we had believed previously that oil might be toxic, and the Clean Air Act or Clean Water Act took those into effect, new scientific research, new scientific discovery, probably better modeling, better equipment, and so on, has revealed in the interim that this thing called PAHs are in oil, and they do long-term damage to organic life.
Correct. And it's even the code word for PAHs sort of on the street are soot, fine particulates.
Okay.
And EPA is pretty much cracking down on these PAHs or these fine particulates because they have also been found to cause similar problems in people, no surprise.
Right.
Respiratory problems.
Right. They've been a big factor in the last few years in terms of air quality in Los Angeles, air quality in Southern California.
Exactly.
Particulate matter. It used to be about smog, and then it became particulate matter is something we'd been ignoring, and now we know is potent.
Right. And it's coming out of the exhaust pipes of our automobiles.
Right.
And it was also all over the beaches of Prince William Sound. It still is. And the cleanup workers, of course, got into it when they sprayed the beaches because of bounce back from the rocks,
Sure.
splashback. So big problem. Okay, so we've got chronic harm to wildlife. Now, I don't want to paint this picture that the sound is not recovering. It is recovering, but it's recovering unevenly. The parts of the sound that were most heavily oiled, the bays that faced north and acted like catcher mitts as the oil came, swooping down. There's still oil on those beaches, and there's not a whole lot of life. So that's a problem. But other areas are slowly recovering.
Yeah, I did look at it. If I may, Rikki, I looked at an exchange between you and ExxonMobil on the GRIST website, in which your last entry begins, ExxonMobil and I disagree on just about every point of fact about Exxon's 89 spill in Prince William Sound. But Exxon wrote, Prince William Sound has had 7 record salmon runs and several near-record salmon runs since the Valdez accident. True?
Salmon have recovered, herring have not.
Okay.
And a recent paper, and that's fine. That's great,
Yeah.
Basically what we saw was the strong survived with salmon, and they came back. What's happening with herring is that they're critical to the ecosystem of Prince William Sound, and they got slammed so low in population that the rest of the ecosystem eats what they produce every year.
Sure.
So the scientists are saying they're in a predator pit, and they can't get out of it. Now, and they don't know when they're going to get out of it. Fishing is closed indefinitely, which means for those fishermen who held a $300,000 herring seine permit, and you are losing about $60,000 per year by not fishing. Okay, multiply that by 10 years, which is how long our fishery's been closed. It was open for 2 years in 97, 98. Now it's closed indefinitely, the herring fishery. So that's $600,000. Now jump ahead to the Supreme Court hearing, and you see why we have a little bit of a problem here with what happened.
So the Supreme Court, what's interesting about that, and I think some of this may have to do with legal niceties, that you're saying there's been a lot of research since we originally sued in 94 that indicate there is greater long-term damage. I'm guessing the Supreme Court ignored that rightfully or wrongfully based on the way the law works. I'm asking you.
Actually, it's the way the Bill of Rights works. The Seventh Amendment says that basically lawyers cannot retry matters of fact, and so the matters of fact get kind of carved in stone, if you will, which is not a good thing, because over 2 decades, we have the equivalent of Columbus sailing around the world here. The world was flat. Now the world is round. Oil did not cause long-term harm. Now we know oil does cause long-term harm. We can't get compensated for it because of the way the law is structured.
So given that, could the Supreme Court have ruled differently, even though they couldn't take into account that new knowledge?
Yes, because what the Supreme Court didn't have anything to do with damages. It only looked at the punitive side of the equation. Were they excessive? Were they allowed? And after deciding just barely that they should be allowed in a maritime law case, the Supreme Court went on to legislate from the bench and make law. And the law that they made, that they basically pulled out of air, was that punitive damages in a maritime lawsuit here should be not exceed compensatory damages. Now, this is where I have a problem. I have lots of problems, and this transcends now into the civics part of it.
Yes. Now we're going to get into, and we're going to look at the broader implications for the power of corporations, the rights, the responsibilities, the lack of accountability of corporations in our society.
Punitive damages has been the tool used by people to hold these big businesses accountable. It's this threat of a big financial award that keeps big businesses, health and safety laws, okay, environmental laws, okay, we'll kind of follow them because we don't want to be liable for these big punitive damages. So our tool has been removed. Now, what the Supreme Court did, besides the 1-to-1 ratio, is they tied it to the compensatory damages. Let's go back to 1994. Here's the jury sitting looking at Exxon and saying, man, this is a big corporation and they make a lot of money. What is it going to take to change their corporate behavior? The jury didn't look at tying it to damages at all. They looked to compensatory damages. The jury set that aside and said, here's a big corporation. How do we hold these big corporations accountable? And the jury decided that it would be 1 year's net profit. Now, what the Supreme Court, well, first of all, the Supreme Court shouldn't even be doing this, okay? What Congress should do now is take a look at this Supreme Court decision, because people-made law trumps judge-made law. And the questions Congress should ask are, one, do we want to cap punitive damages? Businesses are...
And let me just say that you're saying Congress should look at this question. In fact, Congress has been looking at this question and has, I think, and it may not be Congress, it may be state legislatures, but it seems to me all the movement has been in the direction of capping punitive damages rather than seeing them as the tool they are for keeping corporations in line.
But Congress has the ultimate authority. Yes, states can do this differently, but what's happening here is there's been pressure for the past, since the Powell memo in 1971, if you really want to know, has been constantly driving punitive damages down.
Right.
And what Congress can do is take a look at this and say, if we want to cap punitive damages, do we want to cap them to a ratio to compensatory, or do we want to cap them to a ratio of corporate profit? Because if we cap it to corporate profit, then we still have a tool of holding these corporations accountable.
Right. And one of the other things,
tool to change their behavior.
One of the other things I know you've pointed out is that and others have pointed out, the Supreme Court said, businesses need some reliability. These huge punitive damages, they make it difficult for businesses to plan. And a point that you and others have made is that it is exactly that unpredictability of punitive damages that might make them say, this is a cost of business we can't predict, so we better be careful and abide by the law.
Or how about making it so predictable that it's going to cost you 1 year of your net profit? That's predictable.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
And then the Supreme Court can't do what they did was, you mentioned that they reduced it 80%. Well, they actually reduced it 98% of what the jury awarded, which was 1 year of net profit.
I see.
Because ExxonMobil's profits have gone up to $40 billion now.
So when the actual judgment was not $2.5 billion, it was a percentage of profit?
Yes.
Okay. So then, as their profit it happened that the decision came down at the year when their profits hit $40 billion. So I see what you're saying, that it would have been an enormously bigger amount. Let's talk in the 1.5 minutes that I've got left. You have said that you think that the relationship of society to corporations, the relationship of corporations to society, is the civil rights movement of this era. You got a minute and a half. Tell me why that is.
Well, there's been some business polls that have been conducted that show people think that corporations have too much influence in our everyday lives. And in fact, back in 1886, the federal judiciary sort of created corporate persons. And the corporations have become an avenue for consolidation of wealth and power over the next 120 years. And that wealth and power is what will corrupt and ultimately destroy the republic. So I think now it's up to people to realize who's in charge here. Is it we the people, or is it corporations? Because whoever is in charge, their values get codified into law. What is law but a reflection of the values? Do we want human values and community values, which include non-economic damages, which we didn't get a chance to talk about, but this whole quality of life stuff? Or do we want corporate values, which is only about making money? And we're going to have a difficult time reaching a sustainable future if we go with the corporate model and with corporate values.
Okay,
so I believe that.
I've got to let you go. So again,
All right.
You can learn more at soundtruth.info. Thank you, Rikki Ott. Keep up the good work.